Thank you all once again for joining us for this screening of Jonathan Larson's Tik Tok Boom. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to celebrate this film by bringing together a unique panel of guests to talk about Jonathan's time as a student here at Adelphi, as well as projects many of them worked on with Jonathan after he graduated. So thank you all so much for sticking around for this. We are going to try and keep this to about 30 or 45 minutes. Now, please welcome all of our panelists, Victoria Leacock Hoffman, Kerry Prep, Maggie Lally, and Nicholas Petron. All of them were with Jonathan in one way or another while he was a student at Adelphi, and we'll tell you more about them in just a minute. But to lead this discussion, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator, Jennifer Ashley Tepper. Jennifer is a devoted theater historian. Her series of books, The Untold Stories of Broadway, had Volume 4 published earlier this year. She has also been the producer of multiple Broadway and off-Broadway shows and is the creative and programming director at Feinstein's 54 Below. She spent years in the archives of the Library of Congress, poring through Jonathan Larson's papers and recordings to create the Jonathan Larson Project, a series of concerts of previously unheard or rarely heard Jonathan Larson music that became a fantastic album that many of you may be aware of. And if not, I encourage you to find that. This research also came in handy as she worked with the team for the film that you just saw in many ways that I will let her talk about as a history consultant for the film. But with that, please enjoy and take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you. So as you could tell from that introduction, I'm clearly geeking out to share the stage with each of you. Thank you for being here. Let's just dive right in. I want to know from each of you, when did you first meet Jonathan? What is the first time you remember meeting him? Like, what was your first impression of him? Why don't we start with Nick?
He auditioned to get into the department. My first memory of him in the Olmsted basement, which is very different now. He came in like a spark plug and went right to the piano. And this is an acting audition. So he did his monologues, but after he putzed on the piano for a while. And that was my first impression. Who is this guy? He's a firecracker. Wow. Yeah.
It's amazing. Vicky?
So is this the Olmsted or is this not the Olmsted?
No.
This is not the Olmsted. So pretend this is the Olmsted. And I was a freshman. And in the old days, they used to make us do 140 hours of tech hours in the first semester.
That's true.
That was a lot of tech hours. And I was doing lighting, which for someone who wants to be in front of the lights was intimidating because you don't want to die by being electrocuted. And I was focusing the lights, and they're hot, and they're way up there, and on Jonathan Larson, the star of the senior class, playing Christ in Godspell, in a circus motif, holding 2 rings, being crucified and tried to sing, and it's actually really hard to be elevated. He's not a gymnast. You know, John was many things, a gymnast now. But I was focusing the lights, and I had an internal monologue moment where I said, he's the one. And I knew at 18, coming from New York City, still a virgin, I knew that he was the one. And he was my first love, which he was. And then after 6 months, he was a very sweet boyfriend, very romantic. And after 6 months, we had a fight over a movie. Secretly, years later, I realized he was right and I was wrong. But it was enough to turn our romance into a deep and lasting friendship, which it was until he passed. And yet I want to just let you know, Jonathan's in the house right now. His dad made me put some of his ashes in little silver things, and some of us have them. So he's here, and he can hear you. So anyway, so.
Jonathan and I were in the same class at Adelphi, so I just remember freshman year, we had 8 o'clock movement class, I believe, right? We had movement class at 8, we had voice at 9:30, and then acting right after that.
Not joking around. Like,
No, we're not joking. But let me tell you something. Most of us were not awake at 8 a.m. And I loved to sit in the back of the room and kind of take it all in. Jonathan was front and center. Front and center, every single class. That's what I remember about Jonathan, my initial impression, right there in front, getting it.
I was a senior in the program at the time when John was a freshman. So my first association with him was the freshmen every year do what's called a freshman workshop. Literally 4 weeks into the new year, the new semester, they go into rehearsal. And Jacques Burdick, who founded the program, was their director. And he came to me and he said, I want to do something different this year. I'd like to do an original musical for this freshman class. And he said, will you write the music? So he and I collaborated on this musical together, Te Deum for Young Comedians, it was called. And Jacques wrote the text, and I wrote music and some lyrics with Jacques and presented it to the class. And that was the first time we had worked together. So we had a lot in common in terms of musical theater. We talked often about compositions, and we'd get off on different chord structures that we found in it. But he was kind of like a comrade in arms, because there was nobody else in the program who wrote like I would write. And that was the beginning of our relationship.
Cool. So before we get into, and I'm so excited to hear more about the projects each of you worked on with Jonathan, what was it like to see this film? Did it bring back anything specific about Jonathan? Anything that you were like, oh yeah, he ate bananas in rehearsal all the time? You know, was there anything small or large that you started thinking about during the film?
I think there were moments for me that brought me to tears because Andrew was fabulous, but he also, there were moments where he looked exactly like Jonathan, and it was stunning. It's hard to recover from just watching this piece. It was incredibly well done.
Yeah. You know, one extraordinary thing is that, you know, at the end during the credits, you saw some footage involving Jonathan at the diner, elsewhere, and almost all of that, if not all of it, was shot by Vicky. And there is a character in the film that is sort of holding the camera and is like Vicky. So in a way, a lot of the reason Andrew Garfield gets to look so much like Jonathan is because you captured it. It's really magical. What was that?
No.
It's Lauren Marcus. Oh, cool. You know, there's like, people think there's 100 Easter eggs in this film. There's actually 1,000. So go back, watch it on Netflix. It'll be really exciting. I noticed 2 things, and I've worked on this movie for years, that I didn't notice until just now, so. No, it's okay.
I'd say that it is hard. This film, I talked to Julie Larson, his sister, about it after the premiere in California. And we were saying that we hadn't cried yet because it's so much. It's not one moment. This is like 10,000 moments. Yeah. And the apartment, John's apartment, is like 99.5% like the dirt's replicated. They apologized to us that they widened the interior hallway by half a foot. I'm like, you're shitting me. I was like it's like, and so the problem, it's funny. I finally cried last night when I talked to Andrew Garfield's dad. like I finally was enough away from it for a minute that I was like trying to share something, and I suddenly couldn't talk anymore, and I was like starting to shake, and people see it coming, they're like, but it's just. Anyway, so it's just, this is John. It's different, but it isn't, so. Not one memory, 1,000.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about you?
I just want to say the same thing. And I did. My face mask is damp. Seriously, it is just beautiful. It reminded me of so many little things that we did after school together. Mm-hmm. Some of the things he asked, when I would do cabarets after I got back from grad school. There were 2 cabarets I did, and it just brought back the memories of when I did Between New York and a Hard Place. He asked to put 3 songs in it because he was working on Boho Days or 3090, and he wanted to know what those, he was doing it as a solo show. He wanted to know how those songs sounded with other voices. And so for him to hear Sunday Brunch with 12 actors in it, you know, with a lyric soprano, like singing that Sondheim. I don't know, it's very, very moving. It brought back a lot of wonderful memories. And I guess eerie is like, it sounds negative saying eerie, but it was, because I thought Andrew was so inhabited him so beautifully that, you know, I was in a constant process of recovery and then just emotion. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very moving for me to watch this. There were two things that struck me from the film that I remembered about Jonathan, specifically when the guy from Playwrights Horizon,
Ira Weitzman.
right, when he says to him, you know, you write songs, or maybe it was Michael who said, you write songs about anything, when he's talking about the sugar. He said that was an exercise. Another exercise Jonathan did that he told me about when he was here, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna try that. He would take songs, strip out the melody of known songs, and keep the chord structure, and then rewrite new melodies. And he did it with, I think the first song he did it with was The Police had just come out when I was a senior.
Yeah.
And it was the first album before Regatta de Blanc. So it was like Can't Stand Losing You, I think was from that first album. He did it to that. And then he did it with another song the following year. By then I was gone, but my wife was a year behind me. So she would regale me with that. And then he did one to Moondance. So and I thought, oh, it's a neat exercise. I'm gonna try that. So we would kind of talk about that. And seeing him after college when he worked at Moondance, I'd bump into him because I'd be in the city a lot. And I'd say, are you still doing that exercise? He said, oh yeah, you know, it's a regular thing I do. And the second thing that struck me was his relationship with Sondheim. He wrote the Sondheim when he was here.
Yeah.
He would just go on and on about Sondheim. And I don't know if he did it with you, but I know he did it with Tracy Robinson. She'd talk about going back to his dorm room, and he'd take his little phonograph out, and he'd put on a record, and he'd just look at Tracy when he played it. Like, do you get it? Do you get it? And he just adored Sondheim. And I'd say, write him a letter. You know, I'd just shut up, write him. And he did. He wrote him a letter. I said, the worst thing that could happen is he won't write you back. He's not going to say, don't contact me. Sondheim wrote him back. And that was kind of like the beginning of their mentoring relationship.
That's amazing. Yeah, not a lot of people know that Jonathan actually got to observe rehearsals of the original Into the Woods because of what started here, his correspondence with Sondheim.
And just the woman who played Kim in that advertising when he's doing the words, the blonde woman, that's the original Little Red Riding Hood.
Danielle Furlan,
And she was in Little Night Music as well.
Yeah.
That cracked me up.
The casting feels like Jonathan's fever dream to me. It's like...
Oh my gosh, all those Broadway stars. Wow.
So there are so many fascinating projects that each of you worked on with Jonathan. As I did my research, I saw your names and his papers on shows that people might not have heard of. So starting with the shows at Adelphi, I have to hear about the steak tartare caper. Tell us all about that. We start with that.
Yeah, well, it was funny. We were talking about what are we going to do? We had done, I think, 2 cabarets before that. And he said, we need a plot. We need something to do. I said, how about Nick and Nora Charles meet Sam Spade in Chicago to solve a murder? And he said, great idea, great idea. Let me go research the period. And he said the 30s.
Explain to them who Nick and Nora Charles are.
Oh, yeah, right.
Just a little bit.
Okay. Nick and Nora Charles were characters created for film in the 30s. Well, yeah, 30s and
90 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was. And they were suave and sophisticated and solved crimes, like with one finger. Meanwhile, Sam Spade was this rough and tumble detective, right? So we had those 2 varying poles of craziness in Chicago. And I came up with a lyric because a friend of mine, rest his soul, Charles Hudson, who mentored me when I was a young actor, told me about when he came out in Chicago, and he said, you know, I made my decision on Clark and Division, which was a cross street in Chicago. And that stuck in my head. So we made that as one big song for one of the characters. Anyway, he got deeply into the 30s stuff and created this beautiful score. My lyrics were okay, but the score was beautiful. The book was silly and funny. And I think actually, who solved the crime?
Don't give it away.
All right, I won't tell you. Somebody solved the crime.
Nancy Drew.
And Maggie was one of the main characters in that cabaret.
Yeah.
Greta Schlau.
Right.
If
The,
memory serves.
the German dance captain, and if you know me, you'd know how funny that was.
And she was a schizophrenic, too. So, yeah, Maggie was in the original company of Steak Tartare.
So cool. And Jonathan, there's so much of it that he recorded later and that he stuck with that show.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
They also did it after Jonathan died here. Nick directed it with the class in about 97, maybe.
Yeah.
And me and my friend videotaped it. And you can have all those tapes anytime you want.
Okay.
We got to make the movie. No.
Yeah. And the title is something to be explained as well, but I don't know if you want me to explain it.
So tell us about, what are other highlights of shows that you did together at Adelphi? They have fascinating titles, and you should read everyone's full bio in the program, because obviously we don't have enough time to get to everything, but I was like, oh, these titles, the show titles. Kerry, do you want to?
No, by the time, John was not writing the cabaret till after I graduated.
Oh, gotcha.
There was somebody else doing the music with Nick, and then after they left, Nick had asked John to write the music, and that's when John started writing music for the cabarets. I know John struggled with whether he wanted to be an actor or a musician, and I think he posed that question to Sondheim, and I think Sondheim's response was, I know a lot of starving actors, I don't know many starving musicians, and I think that's when he decided, composers.
Yeah. In some of his journaling around the time he was writing Tik, I feel like he came back to the fact that, like an Eric Bogosian, he was going to do his own rock monologue, partially as a vehicle, mostly as a writer, but partially as a vehicle for himself.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to say, I wasn't in it. I was here for a year and a half, and then I went to the city, back to the city. But in my first year, Jonathan had written Sacramento Minority, which later became Saved, because who can spell Sacramento Minority or knows what it is? But here, it was a top secret project that his class was doing, or was it for the class below? David
was in his class,
Armstrong
David Armstrong and
Jonathan. And everybody was abuzz, and rehearsals were secret, and we knew something big was happening in the rehearsal rooms. And then when it came out, it was the Jesse Helms period, Anita Bryant. There was a time the homophobic the outward hatred of anyone who was in the arts, gay, like it was just horrible period of time. And this show eviscerated the moral majority that they were called, because it was really an immoral, like if people were embracing Christianity, the way they were doing it was, Jesus wouldn't have liked it. It was ugly. And the show was shocking. And that was when I knew Jonathan wasn't just cute and tall and a talented actor, but brilliant, a genius. And it was shocking. The audiences were shocked, and it sold out. And no school likes to spend extra money. They spent actually money to videotape it properly with hired people, so I'm just saying, that was when everybody knew that the composing was a big deal. And then Nick kept him, I don't know if John ever made money as an actor. I don't remember him ever being in a play that he was being paid to be in New York, but he was always coming back to Adelphi, writing cabarets for years after, and I would come out with John to see my friends who were still in the school doing these cabarets, like half a dozen of them. Yeah. Him paying him and commissioning these original works, there wouldn't be Jonathan Larson as we know him without Nick. So I just want to say.
We also worked outside of here, too. We did some songs for a TV show called Electric High. And he did the composing for An American Tale. Not the film, but the spin-off stuff for Scholastic. And so I hired him for
He
that.
still gets royalties for that.
I hope so.
It seems like also so many of the seeds were planted for, he was given the freedom to write about political topics, things that came back in his Tik Tok Boom and Rent. So much of that was like the freedom he was given topic-wise
Yeah,
with you.
absolutely. Well, that was what Jacques taught me. Jacques Burdick, let's not forget, who was Jonathan's master teacher when Jonathan was here, taught us all about the cabaret. No sacred cows. What's important? Cut everybody's legs off if they deserve it. And so we ran with it.
Yeah.
And when Maggie took over the cabaret stuff, ran with it too. And Kerry was a part of that through the rest. So yeah, no sacred cows. It's hard to say that now because there are a lot of sacred cows that don't.
But really, we were trained in that Brechtian tradition. And also something about Adelphi at that time was that we were given free rein to fail. We were given free rein to explore. So if somebody wanted to direct something, there's the stairwell space, take it. You have time to do the work, go ahead, do it. You want to direct, you want to write something, right? How many students wrote plays? Dan Kagan wrote Remove at that time, and there were actors in it. So everybody was, it was exploring, I think, the limits and risking failure because it wasn't just accepted, it was really encouraged. And I think that's the way you grow. Just one thing I wanted to mention about Jonathan, starting with Steak Tartare, as I remember, which is that's where he started the fugue thing. Like if you listen to him, Jonathan's love of fugues. And that was the first time I remember that really being present. And then senior year, I did a cabaret, The Great American Letdown, based on Studs Terkel work with a lot of classmates did lyrics for it. But Jonathan did the music for a 10-minute long opening song that became a fugue in that by senior year. Yeah.
Do you have a copy of it?
I do. Sure.
Library of
somewhere.
Congress.
Yeah. No, I just have a copy of the audio. Yeah.
Maggie, will you also tell us about Skirting the Issues? I just want to hear you talk about what that was and how Jonathan came to work on it with you.
Yeah. I was teaching at NYU at that time, and I had come back to New York. We started a theater company called New York Rep in 80-something in Amsterdam, and I wanted to get back into cabaret again. But I didn't consider myself, and I don't, a writer. So I enlisted the writers from NYU to do sketch writing and stuff. And I'm not sure how I'm not sure how our paths crossed again, but I remember asking him. I shared with him the sketches that we were doing. Some of them were pretty raw. Some of them weren't as raw, they were silly. And asked him to write the opening song. Skirting the Issues was a feminist cabaret. It was a woman's cabaret, It was a story from the point of view, all of these issues from the point of view of women at the time. It was that late 80s, right? And he wrote this opening song called White Male World that if you heard it today, you'd think it was written yesterday. Right? Wouldn't you say?
It's thanks to you that it exists. We put it in the Jonathan Larson Project, so you can hear that version on the album, and everyone would freak out and just go, feels like the 2010s. It feels like right now.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
the film we saw tonight, Come to Your Senses, was written more than 35 years ago, maybe?
Just think about that.
And it's so now. You know what I mean? It's and it's sad that it takes 35 years when you write a great song for the world to hear it. It's kind of painful. It's good that people kept going, but it happened.
I wanted to say that I teach musical theater at other schools as well, and I had a musical theater for performance class here I taught for a while. And a lot of times kids would bring in songs from shows, and it always just kind of got me right here anytime somebody would bring in Come to Your Senses. They had no idea of my association with John. Or when junior highs would hire me to play for their winter concerts, and the kids would sing Seasons, and I'd be playing. They have no idea how I knew John. And I always teared up every time thinking that I'm playing for John.
Yeah. course. So speaking about Tik Tok Boom, and of course, Victoria, you were instrumental in bringing it to the stage in the first place. Can you guys speak about, did you see Jonathan perform songs from it in different times? Did anyone see any of those workshops? Vicki, if you want to talk about your journey at the very beginning of when Tik Tok Boom was being created.
In the 1.5 minute version, or the 1 minute version is in, he had done Superbia for all those years, and the workshop that you see in this is so much better than the actual workshop that John had to endure. And Jace Alexander, who was actually the original Josh Out, came and saw it on Sunday, and he was like, but he was an actor, not a singer. Good actor, okay singer. and it was in a dark hole, small, this big, over here, and one stand-up piano, no drums, no nothing else, just the piano. John didn't win those fights, no cathedral-like thing. I mean, Lin-Manuel was like, it's like a cathedral. I wanted it to be like this is his church. And I'm like, instead of the black hole that it actually was. And so when John started writing, so after all that, John was so enraged at Ira Weitzman, and yet it is so beautiful, this makeup that's happened between John's spirit and Ira. Ira was there last night. Ira carried guilt it makes me sad, for decades, that he gave John such a hard time on that one thing. But there would be no Rent without Ira Weitzman, because Ira Weitzman, maybe feeling guilt, and maybe having seen 3090, Boho Days, Tick Tick, where the monologues about him and Superbia were really kind of mean. like it's made a little nicer about that. But Ira recommended Billy Aronson, who had this idea of updating La Boheme and Rent, and as an Upper West Side comedy, it was a little different. But he recommended talk to John Larson. Mm-hmm. So without that recommendation, Rent, period, wouldn't have happened. And God knows when John would have died, or if it would have been the same timing, but history would have been changed. But so John decided after this big epic process that he was going to do, because Eric Bogosian, Spalding Gray, and Laurie Anderson were rocking it in One People shows. And then Dennis Leary started working on something downtown. And John, I remember him saying to me, like, I might not be Spalding Gray or Eric Bogosian, but I could definitely do what Dennis Leary's trying to do. And nothing against Dennis Leary. If Dennis is as good as Jonathan and vice versa, they're great. But so John said, I'm going to try something different, a rock monologue. And also Matt O'Grady, his best friend, had been diagnosed HIV positive. So his whole world, his childhood best friend, in a time when you thought it was a death sentence, because it was for 95% of the people with it. I mean, by really the grace of God, Matt remained asymptomatic, never was on the cocktail. He was at the opening with us last night with his husband and his mother. Mm-hmm. So there is some blessings, but he just, so I'm just saying, so he wrote Tick, did it at Second Stage. They invited the New York Times reviewer as a buddy, a friend of theirs, who told them that he liked it a lot, and John was good, and he would be able to give it a good review, but not a great review. This is on a workshop that he saw. So then they decided they wouldn't produce it because it would get a great review, which, so now you're not it drove us crazy. So then we did it at the Village Gate, where all I had to do was have a big empty theater, and all my friends bought drinks, so they gave me the theater for free because I grew up in Fire Island with the daughters. All you had to do is get people to buy drinks. And then John did it at the New York Theater Workshop. And meanwhile, it was getting a little more cynical and a little more cynical each time. Like, I love the David Saint directed early version, and then Pippin Parker was directing it. But John was getting angrier and angrier because it was 1990, 91, 92. And in the fourth iteration of it, he realized it's just as hard to get a one-man rock monologue produced professionally in a run, not for a weekend, as a big show. And meanwhile, my three best friends, Pam, Gordon, and Allie, from childhood had all been diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. They all were very sick when they were diagnosed. And John had even dated Pam, and then he had to get, it was like a nightmare. It was a nightmare. It was as though everybody got bad COVID, and everybody was dying. You have to imagine in this room, half of you would have died because you dated someone and didn't use a condom, because you were using birth control. And then you would just die a horrible, horrible death. That was, just wait, it's gonna be a few minutes, so. So that was so that's why he went back to Rent. But the Tik journey is this, and it did lead to Rent. He couldn't have written, this isn't an early musical. This was written early smack dab in the middle of writing Rent. He wrote 3 songs for Rent, wrote Tik, and then wrote this. Anyway.
Totally. No, it's a big story. You raised your hand. Did you see Village Gate, Tik Tok Boom?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
So what did you think?
I loved it. I liked it. And I knew, and I spoke to him about the palpable anger that was in it. And he didn't disavow that point at all. He was pissed. And rightly so.
Frustrated.
Yeah.
And pissed.
Oh no, go ahead, Kerry.
There was a moment in the film that also rang true for me, that when he sells his books, he did that.
Yeah.
He actually would go and sell his books, and shortly before he passed, a few weeks before he passed, I had been told that he wanted to see the movie Dead Man Walking with Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn. Is that the one? He sold books, so he had enough money to go see the movie. And he was poor. He had no money.
Yeah.
Despite coming from the White Plains area, he did not have any money. And it was shortly before Rent opened in that 50-seat theater, wherever it was, just weeks before.
Just about his poverty. In California, Matt O'Grady asked if he could bring his friend Christina Haig to the opening. And Christina was the last person he took out on a formal date. And to do that, 2 months or a month and a half before all was lost, he had to borrow money from Matt, who's, Michael. Not only borrow money from Matt to take her to a restaurant, but he also, Matt made the reservation, picked out the restaurant, and lent him a jacket. So she was sitting in between us, and the whole time through the movie, she was gasping, it was so moving. But he followed his dream, and he quit the job at the diner before he died.
Yeah.
And that was one of the great blessings, that he believed he could make it.
Yeah. He also, he believed that the Moondance helped him be the kind of artist he wanted to be. That's all true about, he didn't want to write jingles as his day job. He wanted to be a waiter so he could be there as little as possible. And I found, there's him budgeting how to record those 3 songs from Rent, the first 3 songs from Rent, and going $10 for this and pencils, 50 cents. And at the same time going, if I eat this, this, and that this week, I can save more money to record I Should Tell You. It's all in the film. It's so great to hear about it firsthand from you guys too. So speaking about, other than Tik, also just staying friends with Jonathan, collaborating with him on things, how did you feel like he evolved as an artist from the time that you guys were all right here until later projects? What kinds of things did you see him kind of be influenced by, or how did he kind of evolve in your eyes?
Well, I was at the apartment 2 or 3 times during this period. But we'd often go downstairs where there was heat at the Ear Inn, the Ear Inn around the corner, and talk about his dreams and how he was doing. And we drank a lot of wine. And I picked up the check, of course, because he had no money. But he kept talking about what he wanted to do, what he wanted to accomplish. And at that point, I knew Alan Nan very well. And I know Julie pretty well now, too. It was watching him grow, but feeling, what can I do to help? I was no longer in a position to really get him work. I got as much as I could for him, and then I think actually he got some work from Jan Wiener, Rolling Stone guy. Him, yeah, the Rolling Stone guy. He got some work doing something for him.
I had I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I had made a rule that I would do any job that I was offered to do with video. So you end up doing some weddings and some this and some. And I had been hired to film Griffin Dunn's bachelor party video by a friend of my brother's. And one of the people I videotaped saying disparaging things about Griffin Dunn's sexual prowess. There was a lot of people who had an opinion about that. I was surprised, including like Penny Marshall and Buck Henry. But one of them was Jan Wenner. And I'm in Jan Wenner's, the editor, he owns Rolling Stone magazine, you know, and it's a family solo operation. And it's, you know, and the time, it was bigger than now. And I was at his house filming him, and you know, my father's a famous documentary filmmaker, so I said, oh, my dad made Monterey Pop with D.A. Pennebaker. Oh, so suddenly I was cooler, not just a girl. And then he said, well, what do you do? And I totally made something up. I just went, I'm currently, well, it was kind of true, but I said, I'm editing my 6-year-old nephew's birthday video into a 6-minute film called Willie Turns 6. And he looked at me and he said, can you do that? And I literally just didn't know what he meant. And I said, yeah. And so he said, let me get your number. And like 100 hours of his children's videotapes arrived. And I was to edit them into little amusing bon mots. And so I actually quickly, after starting, and I made a lot of money doing this for years, but I immediately called on Jonathan, who needed money, and said, can you make a song for Theo's birthday or Gus's birthday, like, oh, Theo, or they're a rock and rollin' Wenner kid. They're so cool, you'll flip your lid, Gus. You know? But I mean, and Jonathan would write these soundtracks, and half the score of Rent's demo tapes were recorded. Jan would pay like $800 for the recording session of, you know, Glory. We'd do the soundtrack. I would put it under one of the videos, and I would pay John a $100 licensing fee. But when Jan Wenner went to the opening of Rent on Broadway, he saw me and he said, do I own half this show? And I think he was only half joking.
Oh my gosh.
I said, no, we licensed the material.
That's amazing.
It was smart.
Yeah.
Take advantage in a very good way. But he got, imagine all his kids have original songs composed by the composer of Rent. How worth it was it?
Yeah, they're great. I've heard some of them. And Nick, you mentioned the Ear In. I just wanted to say, if anyone feels like going and visiting Jonathan Larson's legacy when you're in New York, the Ear In, which is one of the oldest bars in New York, where Ear In.
Like E-O-N.
It used to say bar in, but part of the neon burned out.
Really?
Yeah, that's why it says
It's true.
ear in.
Yeah.
And they never changed it. It became known as the ear in. But that's because part of the
It's
B.
on Spring and Greenwich Street.
Greenwich.
Yeah, so Jonathan's apartment was at 508 Greenwich, and you hear that in the lyric in the show. And the Ear In is right around the corner. And still there, right near both of those things, is the phone booth where you would call and he would throw down the key, which is also depicted in the film.
And that's what they filmed. I mean, you see John's Real House, the last day of shooting before the pandemic. Yeah. The day they shot at John's building, and including him looking out the window and, you know, going in and out and the street scene and the phone. And at the end of that day, at like 3 in.the morning, they announced they were closing down because of COVID.
Yeah.
And it was a miracle. They had only shot 10 days, I think, of exteriors. It's a miracle. And Lin-Manuel Miranda's oomph. Yeah. That no one wanted this to stop. And they waited till like October, I think they picked up again for 2 months. Yeah. Jen's in the Superbia scene and had to be locked in a hotel room for 2 weeks, the extras in that scene. 2 weeks where if the intern left the food outside the door, if you opened the door while the intern was still there, you lost your job.
Yep, it's true.
door closed, you waited till they were gone. And that's how, this is the only New York City set that never stopped for COVID.
It's true. The staff of this movie and the COVID safety folks, like, they kept it so safe. As mentioned, I was scared. I didn't even like open the window. I was in quarantine during the election. I didn't even open the window to be like,
before
woo!
the vaccine.
Yeah. But it felt very in the spirit of Jonathan, you know, the fact that like we made it through these things and made this thing, you know, it's exciting.
Well, I kind of let the cast, it's hard to explain to you, young people, most of you, what the AIDS epidemic was like. But COVID, for them to be living through COVID, I think gave a gravitas to what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Because you suddenly were afraid of people. Mm-hmm. Like with AIDS, you were afraid to sleep with anybody. And you're in your 20s. You know, like, you know, it was like you'd find out you were going to die 2 years later, you know, so. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, no, I have another question related to something you spoke about, Kerry, about Jonathan's influences and things that you listened to together. You mentioned the Police, and you know, in talking about him crafting songs from other songs, were there other things that you discussed as comrades, as far as inspirations, specific musical groups?
Not necessarily. Mostly it was Sondheim in the beginning, and then the Police was another one. Van Morrison was Moondance. But I noticed when I wrote one of the songs, I have the cassette recording of the show that your class did, Te Deum, somewhere in the bowels of my basement. That has Jonathan singing on it, because he had a couple of solos in it that had him singing. And I tried to look it out. It's in a box somewhere, and I couldn't find it. But I know it's there. But I remembered him remarking, because there was one song I wrote called Fat Cat, which deals with a very heavy woman who can't get work because she's heavy. And I put a line from Annie Get Your Gun in there, the actual melody, anything you can do, and then I made it minor. I can do better. And it would blow his mind that I took a familiar cut and put it into my song. And then listening to Come to Your Senses, or whatever it is, the other ones where he uses the examples of other music. And it's like, yeah, that's something we did back then. It was great to hear those songs back then when it's like, oh, he tried the same technique to see how he can get into a song. So, you know, we thought alike in that way.
Like
but
moving on up to the East Side or in
moving,
Rent.
right.
Christmas bells. And it used to, what was it originally? We Are the World?
Oh, yes.
It originally was We Are the World, and Bob Geldof, I guess, was offended that he wanted to parody it in Rent.
Said no, yeah.
So they were like, no. They should have said yes, because we'd think of the song.
This might be true too, because I'm not sure who knows it, but Atari Videoland was one song that was absolutely the Police inspired. That was every little thing she does is magic. She wrote the lyrics for it, but he wrote the music.
Magic.
And that was, he used the chord structure for that. Then Sunday Brunch, obviously, you know,
you could
his
hear all
inspiration.
the roots of those songs, because Maggie directed Unsung Larson shortly after he passed, which was all of the unpublished music that we had cassette tapes, because he never wrote much anything down. He would just record them. So we had to be transcribed. So we did that. You could hear all of those songs and all of the future songs that he wrote after that in his music.
Yeah, it's really lovely to have that record, because you can. To really hear it.
I remember Anthony Rapp, there was some song that was cut out of Rent, Door Wall, I think, and I was saying how I kind of missed it. I thought it was it was like a song that was kind of just a transitional song, but it was very poignant. And he said, well, that's really this other song, but it's a reversal of the chords, and like, I'm not a musician, like, I was like, you know.
Yeah.
Cool.
Related to that also, you know, Jonathan, Vicky kind of talked about the trajectory of like Superbia, Tik Tok Boom, Rent, and we also saw it in the film, but Superbia was partially inspired because Jonathan was writing his own musical version of the book 1984 and couldn't get the rights, and then went,
in 1983.
In 1983, hoping to get it produced in 1984, and he wrote to everybody, as you see him calling people, inviting them to Superbia readings. Similarly, it was Dear Joe Papp and Dear Hal Prince, and he couldn't get the rights. It was like impossible, and he went, I'm gonna write my own like dystopian futuristic musical. That became Superbia. So there's such an interesting line between each of those in that way.
And then of course Superbia is part of Tik, and elements of Tik end up in, yeah,
In
it's
Rich.
true.
You were gonna
I just want to do an asterisk quickly. This was Jonathan, as a student, working on a cabaret with me. We'd finish a rehearsal, go back to the city, go to bed. My phone would ring at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was Jonathan saying, Nick, is it okay if I change this lyric to this lyric? And yeah, Jonathan, it's fine. we'll talk tomorrow. And that was a constant, happened more than once.
I love that.
Yeah.
No, John had called me one day in the middle of whatever, and he's like, how do you measure a year? And I said, cups of coffee. And he said, thanks. And I remember it because I was like, okay. You know, like, yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. That's unfortunately all the time we have. Thank you to our brilliant, we're done for the evening, unfortunately. Thank you so much to our brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all so much for coming. Tell your friends about Tik Tok Boom. Thank you to the Flubby. Thank you. Thank you to Adelphi.